Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Queen's Gambit after d4, d5, c4. This begins the Queen's Gambit. We're taking a look at the Queen's Gambit declined, and we're just going to be going straight down the main line of this Queen's Gambit declined. After knight f3, we're going to castle. After e3, black is going to play h6, and here is the main thing that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be taking a look at what they call the Anti-Tartakower variation. Basically, you play h6, you put the question to the bishop, what do you do if they capture? Bishop captures f6 is called the Anti-Tartakower variation. So we're going to be taking a look at what we do against this, how do we play against this, what are the best lines against this, what is the current theory, and hopefully after you watch this video you're going to have a better understanding on how you meet this particular move. So for starters, to understand how to play against the Anti-Tartakower, first we have to understand what is the Tartakower variation in the first place. Well, normally when people play h6 and you put the question to the bishop, White doesn't generally want to give up the bishop pair, so they retreat. They play bishop h4. And the main line after you play bishop to h4 is this move, pawn to b6. This is called the Tartakower variation. Now, when you play the Tartakower variation, you're going into a lot of theory, and I kind of covered why it's actually a little beneficial to have in the move h6 when you play the Tartakower in my video to play h6 or not to play h6, when you're playing the Tartakower variation. But basically the idea is you want to complete your development. You want to bring your knight to d7, your bishop to b7, you want to play pawn to c5. So, a classic example would be, let's say that they play c takes d5. This is one of the many pawn conversions that's possible. You would play knight takes d5, bishop e7, queen e7, knight d5, e takes d5. And the game that I'm following right here in this sort of mainline Tartakower variation is Bertok versus Fischer. And that game continued bishop e2, bishop to e6, castles, pawn to c5. We had dc5, bc5 in that game. Black got the hanging pawns. Fischer brought his queen to b7, queen a3, knight d7, knight back to e1, and then Fischer advanced and sort of started bullying this b2 pawn with his queen. And he eventually just piled everything up on that b2 pawn. And this is sort of like kind of the ideal position of sort of what you would like to get out of the Tartakower. Which, if you're looking at this position and going, this looks really good for black and this looks really bad for white, you might want to play some anti-version of this. So, going back, that's sort of the motivation behind taking the knight right away. Because if we take the knight right away, bishop f6, when we do finally enact this capture on d5, we're not going to be able to take back with the knight. We're not going to be able to find a good spot for our queen. It's not going to be the same. It's going to be a little different. So if, for example, after rook to c1, black could continue in the same vein. He could play the Tartakower, but now when c takes d5 happens, we really have nothing better. We have to play e takes d5, and this position is quite a bit messier than in the mainline Tartakower, where we get to play knight takes d5, we get to exchange off this pair of knights. Here, our bishop on f6 is a little misplaced. Our light squares are a little weak. So after something like bishop to d3, bishop e6, let's just say castles, c5, dc5, bc5, white could play e4, and we would almost be completely dead on the light squares already. So this position would probably just be major advantage white, because if we were to play d captures e4, bishop captures e4 would lose our rook. So we're already in trouble even just here, even just after some basic moves. So we're not going to be able to play our mainline Tartakower beginning with this move, pawn to b6, or at least it shouldn't be advisable. So when you're playing against this anti-Tartakower, you have to do something a little bit different. Now, I wish I could just say, hey, black has got the bishop pair, so we should just be able to blow the board open and use our bishop pair to huge advantage, and we should have some sort of major advantage with the black pieces by playing something like pawn to c5. But the move rook to c1, white's last move, was sort of directly aimed at pawn to c5, and it is a little bit of an annoying move. After you play something like pawn to c5, after just dc5, you don't have something simple like queen a5, which would be the normal type of thing here, where you're double attacking this knight on c3, because this knight is already protected. So there isn't any real threat here when you play a move like queen a5. So they can just isolate your pawn and then just develop. And then even if you try to develop naturally, like say knight a6, castles, and then say knight takes c5, you can run into trouble with a move like b4, for instance, is sort of an issue. And there's more than one issue here, but b4 is sort of an example. Like if you take, they're going to play knight takes d5, and things can go wrong here. This is actually following a chess.com game. This is following Martsayan versus Andrew Tang, played on chess.com back in 2020. Now, another approach, instead of queen a5, you could try knight a6, but again, this position should just be slight edge white. This is following another game. This is following Kozul versus Arandov, and that game continued with just takes on d5, takes on c5, and Black didn't end up going down a pawn, but the isolated pawn position just wasn't very good for him. He managed to get his pawn back, and he's not quite equal. This position should just still be slight edge white. So he's not quite equal yet, and he didn't manage to save the game. He didn't manage to get a draw with the black pieces. But he did sort of blunder out his very next move. Queen f6, his very next move was a mistake. It probably would have just been better to play something like bishop e6, but again, this position is still just slight edge white. So going back, when they play rook c1, you can't just blast away with c5. Now, what's interesting is if they play almost anything other than rook c1, c5 is a great move. So that's something to keep in mind. Just the fact that rook c1 fortifies that knight after you play c5 is really important. So even against queen d2, c5 is totally reasonable. And as a matter of fact, we see top flight players playing c5 in these positions. Even though queen d2 also fortifies the knight, it doesn't fortify it with a rook, it fortifies it with a queen. So it's a little bit different. You can get away with c5 here. And then on there's this game that continued cd5, c takes d4, knight d4, and then e takes d5. You still have the isolated pawn. Bishop b5, knight c6 was this wild game played between Rapport and Wei Yi, played on chess.com back in 2020. Continued bishop c6, bc6, knight c6, queen d6. And these complications are wild, but I'll just go ahead and show them. Queen d5, bishop takes c3 check. Almost looks like you lose the queen, but not quite. After just bc3, black doesn't have queen d5 because knight e7 check picks back up the queen, so he just retreated his queen. And then it looks like knight e7 check, and then king h8, and it looks like, oh, there's a free rook down here, but there's also a free rook down here with queen to c3. So white instead took the bishop, and then black forced a perpetual, just beginning with these checks. So he ended up playing queen c3, and then he forced perpetual with this queen b2, queen b5. But needless to say, the short answer is, against pretty much anything other than rook c1, c5 is reasonable. You can play c5. Even against queen d2, you can play c5. And it's a pretty reasonable move to just open the position for your bishops and just simplify the board in the middle. So how do we play against rook c1? Rook c1 is by far and away the main line. What is the correct thing to play here? Well, the easiest answer to this position is probably just to play d takes c4, even just right away. You might play it. You might wait a move and play it in a move, but the basic idea is after d4, bishop c4, you can play something like knight d7, and now you can continue with either c5 or e5. Is going to be your main idea. So here we're going to have we're following this game Rajabov versus Nakamura, played back in 2021, which continued knight e4 and then c5, and then knight f6, queen f6, castles, rook d8, bishop to b5, c takes d4, queen takes d4, queen d4, knight d4, and then e5, and Nakamura was more than equal after e5. This is another really important equalizing maneuver to remember, is to try to develop this bishop in this direction, bringing the bishop out on the c8 square over to the e file or even the f file and developing that way. So after, for example, knight b3, knight f6, once Nakamura finished his development with bishop e6, not only has he equalized, this position is probably slightly better for black, because black has better space and black's pieces are a little bit better placed. The knight on b3 is a little bit misplaced and the bishop on e6 is better placed. And as a matter of fact, Nakamura went on to win this particular game. So once you equalize and then once you get your pieces sort of lined up in the right locations, you can start pressing a little bit. You can start playing for a win. So dc4 is reasonable. You can also delay dc4 and you can play at a move later. For example, you can play c6, bishop d3, knight d7, get everything set up. Then after castles, now you can play d takes c4. And then after bishop c4, now you can play e5. This is another perfectly reasonable way to try to equalize in the center of the board. And we've got quite a few games from this position. Most of them continued d5, and then black continued with knight b6. And then we have pawn to b3. And then we have a number of continuations from here. But by far and away, the continuation that I think is the simplest is this move knight captures c4. Knight captures c4 takes, and then dc4, knight d5, bishop e6 should just equalize on the spot. I only have one game as an example from this, which continued queen b3, and then black mistakenly played the move bishop takes d5, but probably just b6 on the spot should be at least equality for black, if not a little bit better for black. It's kind of an interesting position. At no point can white ever really take on the f6 square and get rid of his knight in the middle. Like, he has to fortify this knight in the middle and just keep it. And then after rook c8, and then let's say queen a5, we can just develop queen d7. And knight f6 check is never going to be a great idea. After gf6, just kind of fortifying the center of the board, white has some interesting weaknesses on both the c4 and e4 square that black can try to exploit. But the corresponding weaknesses, like let's say rook fd1, queen c6, and you can see we're hitting these weaknesses. The corresponding weaknesses with queen e3, king h7, knight h4 aren't as big of a deal for black, because whenever that knight lands on f5, we're just going to take it with the bishop. So there's not really a huge threat here for black, but black does have pretty significant play against the pawn on c4, the pawn on e4, and even potentially this pawn on a2 with queen a4 and queen a2. There's a lot here for black to work with. But on the whole, if everybody plays correctly from here, the position should apparently just be equality. This should just be equal. So anyways, going back, this is a pretty serious possibility, is just to play this e5 maneuver. And of course, another serious possibility is if you just want to get your opponents out of book, it is very, very possible to just continue with the pawn to a6 move here. And this was played in Topalov versus Carlsen, played back in Nice in 2009. That game continued a6, a3 with the idea of b5. So this was Carlsen's idea. The only thing I don't like about this idea is the position is very, very equal, and it's very difficult to actually get your light squared bishop out. And I can't really find a whole lot of improvements on the Topalov versus Carlsen game just to keep kind of the game alive for black and give black some hope of playing for a win afterwards. But that game continued cd5, cd5, bishop to b1, bishop to b7, we had knight e2, and then pawn to e5. So you still end up having to play this pawn break with pawn to e5, and you end up with this isolated pawn in the middle with your pawn on d5. Your bishop is in a location that I don't really like for black. It's stuck behind this pawn. This is usually bad, to have your floating bishop behind the pawn, even though the bishop is on the long diagonal. You'd rather, in an isolated queen pawn position, you'd rather have your bishop on either e6 or g4. But Carlsen had more than enough to remain equal. After knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, we had knight d4, queen f6, queen to g4, rook ac8, and after queen to d7, there were some wild complications for a minute. We had rook b8, knight to c6, bishop c6, rook c6, rook fd8, and then once the queens got exchanged in this kind of strange manner, rook a6, bishop b2, the position was just completely equal. Carlsen liquidated his isolated pawn. Topalov had to create luft for his king, so he didn't have trouble on the back rank, and then we just had things double, and then this exchange happened, bishop e4, hands were shook, the draw was agreed. There's nothing here for anybody. It's the material is completely equal. You have opposite colored bishops. There are rooks on the board, but everybody's king is equally safe. H4 is it's interesting. I mean, yeah, you make luft. I don't know why Topalov decided to do it in the slightly more weakening way. H3 probably would have been just as legitimate, but a draw is a draw, a result is a result. So just going back to all of this stuff, just to kind of cover what your options are in the Anti-Tartakower. So once they play this Anti-Tartakower, beginning with this move bishop f6, and you recapture with bishop f6, if they don't play rook c1, you can go ahead and play pawn to c5. So like on any move other than rook c1, like queen d2 even, you can go ahead and play c5, and you should have every prospect of equalizing from here. If they do play the move rook to c1, you've kind of got two options. Well, we'll say three options. You can play d captures c4, followed by knight d7 and c5, so you can play dc4 right away. You can play dc4 right away and even play c6, knight d7, and then pawn to e5, or you can play for pawn to e5 the traditional way, with c6, knight d7, dc4, and then e5. Or if you don't want to ever take on c4, if you don't ever want to play d takes c4, you can of course play c6 followed by a6. So just, again, to review these lines, you can play c6, bishop d3, knight d7, castles. You can either play a6 and then follow that up with pawn to b5. as Carlsen played, and this is completely reasonable. Another way that you can play this position is you can play dc4, bishop c4, e5. If you want to play c5, I don't recommend c6, obviously. You don't want to two-step that pawn. You don't want to go c7, c6, and then c6 to c5. So you need to decide whether you're going to play e5 or c5 before you play c6. So once you play c6, you're kind of committed to the e5 push. This particular position and this particular move order is my personal preference. I like playing c6, then dc4, and then e5. I feel like this should completely equalize. It opens the position for the bishops, and it takes advantage of the fact that my bishop has been relocated to the f6 square, sort of by force. White made me put it there. And so I might as well use it because it is occupying that e5 square and allowing me to get in my e5 thrust, which should equalize, and from this position, black should be completely equal. Well, anyways, I hope you found that video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you don't have any more problems playing against the Anti-Tartakower in the future. Thank you very much for watching.